Welcome to the next tutorial. Today I would like to show you how to create a plugin that reads a resource. What is resource? Resource is a place where we can load or read any data. For example, let's create a new resource in Tracardi. There are certain types of resources. Let's create an API call. API call is an API call to the remote system that has some data and we would like to read it. Let's give it a name and enable it, and we can define some credentials like user password and the URL of this API. Let's create it, and now we have a resource. It has some data like configuration, username and password, and this data can be used to connect to the resource and read some data. And this information is used by plugins. For example, Rabbit Publisher uses a resource Rabbit to connect to the Rabbit and then read some information from the queue or post information to the queue. So how you write a plugin that reads this resource information? I've already created a Tracardi Remote API plugin scaffold to show you how to read this data and how can you use it inside your plugin. First I will create a plugin scaffold. I'm using Tracardi CLI for that. We can take Tracardi help and see what can we do. Tracardi. Now let's type a plugin name. Let's name it plugin. Some short description, author, email. We've already configured the plugin in the previous episode. Right now I'm doing it very quickly. Now we have all the files. The main file is plugin. We need to install dependencies. I will create an environment for that, virtual environment. Okay, we have new virtual environment and just now pip install -r requirements. It will install all the requirements and our plugin is ready. It's empty and I will show you how to read a resource into the plugin. Before we start, please notice that there is a test folder. Inside that test folder we have a manual test. When we run it, you can see what's going on inside our plugin. So let's run it, and here we go. The output of the plugin has a port payload and the value on that port is empty. It's empty dictionary, and profile is inside information about profile. This is also empty. Let's see how this manual test is configured. So we have a run plugin function. Inside that function we pass a type of our plugin. We type init, initialization data, we type payload, and we type profile. This is a profile. You can see that actually this is the same. Use this file to test your plugin. Right now let's go to plugin, and as we said before, the init method is used when the plugin is initiated. This is usually when the workflow starts, and run is run when the node inside the workflow is running. First, we need to read our resource in init method so we can use this data. The best way is to do it like this. Storage, we will read through from storage. Let's import the storage. It's located in Tracardi service storage driver. Inside that driver we have several options. The one we need is a resource, and we need to load the resource. Here we have to pass a resource ID. This resource ID is usually configured in the int section, so we have something like source ID, and there is some ID. Right now I type none, so this will come here. Okay, I will just pass some ID, just one right now. This is actually the same as Quarks. So right now I will read this data into an object. I will create an object called configuration. It inherits from Pydantic base model because we want to validate this data, and we say that we have source inside and it is an entity. We have to import entity. Entity also is in Tracardi domain entity. What entity has inside? It has just ID. So this is the same as our schema. We have source and we have ID. Source, and inside here we have ID. Let's run it. We have to wait this function because it is asynchronic function. We pass this data into configuration just to validate it, and we will make self config configuration. We need this information, so how we get it? Oh, sorry, I've made a mistake. Configuration comes from Quarks. This is configuration, and right here we have self config, and see we have source and ID. So this will validate the init. We'll read this ID, pass it here, and from that ID we will read data from our database. This is not a correct ID, so we should see an error. But actually we will see another error, and I want to show you what is happening and how we resolve this error. Okay, let's start it. We have await outside asynchronic function. So it means we cannot use await when the function is not asynchronic. So let's make it asynchronic, and you can see there's already an error in it. Cannot be asynchronic. How can we read an information from the source into our plugin? We need to use a build method. This is a factory method that is used to read the resource and then fill the plugin with the resource data. So right now I will use the synchronic function. It's called build. It has the same signature as init, but it is a static function. So actually it's a static method. Here we go. And what we do, we will read the configuration in the build method. We cannot have self because it's static. Then we will read the resource and we will pass that resource. Let's call it resource. And we will pass that resource to our plugin. Action plugin resource. And we will return it. Now let's see what we are doing. The method build will be executed before init. That means the program comes here, it reads the configuration from the init, it validates it through this model, then we read ID from this model, read from our database the resource, we have resource, and then we pass this resource to init to create an object. So right now we have resource here, and as you can see, this method returns resource. So let's make it like this. I will import it. Right now we don't need this information, we'll just save our resource. Let's run it again. We see one validation error, the source field is required. What does it mean? When we go to our test, you can see that this is our init, what we pass here. We have to pass the information that is the same as here. I'll pass it. I will type none here, so it is the way it should be. And in our test, we'll pass it with the ID. Now let's run it. You can see that resource ID 1 doesn't exist, and this is true. When you go to Tracardi, you can see that in the resource we have API, but the ID is here. It's not 1. I copy it, paste it here. So this is the ID I would like to read. So we don't have any error. Let's see. Just print a resource here. What do we have here? Here we go. This is our resource. We have its type, and inside config we have the data that is defined in our resource. So let's go to our resource, edit. You can see this is the data. I will type here like localhost and some username and password. Username and password, and we see if that changed. Let's save it. Here we go. Run it again and see the credentials are here. So right now we have read a resource into our plugin, but we are missing something, right? Right now our plugin does not have information from the init. How we pass it? This is easy. Just pass the configuration right here, config configuration, and we'll save it like this. And we have two properties that we can read: config and a resource. Let's go and run it. Here you go. This is a resource and this is our config. If we have any additional data, let's go and add some additional data. Here, let's say the data, make it 1. We don't see it. Why? Because it's not defined in our model. So let's name it data. It's an integer. Let's run it, and here we go. This is our data. So I can see if you type anything into init, you have to update your model so it can read the data and it can validate the data, and everything with the build static method is read and passed into our init. And this is how we use it. Okay, and that's it. Thank you.